Welcome back to the Amazon clone. In this video, we'll work on authentication in our NestJS API with Mongo. So let's just explain what we'll do in this video. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement registration and logging in. And the way it's going to work is we're going to have a user send their email and password that they register with. We're going to use the bcrypt library and hash their password. We'll store that in the database. And then when they log in, we'll compare their hash password to the password that they enter. And if it is correct, we'll assign them a JWT. We'll send back a JSON web token so that they can attach that with further requests and we can protect some of our endpoints. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up the command line here. And I'm just going to cd into the API folder. I'm going to cd into the API folder in PowerShell. And I'm just going to install a few of the libraries that we need. So npm install bcrypt, passport-jwt at nest.js /jwt at nest.js/passport. So we can see there we've got passport for our authentication stuff, passport JWT for the JSON web token stuff, bcrypt for the hashing, and then we have the NestJS stuff for the wrapper over the top of those packages. So I'm also just going to run an npm install -d for development mode to get some of the types. So I can get the passport -jwt types. So we just get a little bit of better IntelliSense in there. So what I want to do is, just before we get started, I want to open up the main file, and just above the app that we're listening to the port, and we can actually just go app.enable cores, and that's built in on this Nest factory object. And that just allows us, because we'll be making requests from React in a future video, probably the next video actually, and we just don't want any cause issues between the two servers. So I'm also going to set a app prefix. So I can just run set global prefix here, API, and what this will do is it will just add API to the end of our domain. So we've got localhost 3000/API/ whatever the route is going to be. So just a couple of simple tweaks there. I'll just go ahead and just save that. So what I want to do is I just want to create a few different modules and controllers, just a couple. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have a user module. So I'll run NestJS MongoDB. And if we look in the app module, it should add that there. So we can see that we got the user module. And I'm just going to press up because we're also going to have a second module for auth. And we're separating the modules out because there's going to be some authentication specific stuff, such as generating the tokens and checking the tokens and stuff like that. And then there's going to be user specific stuff, such as, getting the user or anything like that, validating the user, stuff like that. And as the application grows, it's nice to separate those two out from one another, because eventually we'll be wanting more and more user endpoints. So yeah, it just separates the logic out into two different modules. So we can see that here it is in the app module. They've both been referenced here. So let's just open those up. Let's start with the user module. So what we'll do is we'll start with the user schema. So I'm just going to add a schema here in user, and I'm just going to call it user.schema.ts, and we can just use the schema annotation from NestJS Mongoose. So we'll auto import that, and then we can just go ahead and we can just export a class here. I'll call it user, and then we can use the prop annotation to let the class know that it's, or the schema know that it's a property. And we'll have a name here, and a name is nothing more than a string. And inside prop here, I'm just going to have some additional options here. So I'm just going to say required is true, because we're going to require the name along with the email and password to always be there. So let's just change the password, which is also a string, and well, let's say email here and password here, both strings. Everything's required. However, the email needs to be unique. So let's just specify that to true there. So what we'll do is we'll export the type as a user document, and that's the user class along with the document class. And if this is too fast, I've actually covered all of this in great detail in the previous video. So, you know, we're not boring you to death with all the details here. We'll explain the new stuff, but the schemas and documents and all that sort of stuff is covered in the previous video. So what we want to do now is we just want to export the schema. So we're going to have a constant variable here that we're exporting, and we'll call it user schema, and we're able to use the schema factory from, you know, NestJS Mongoose, and then we can just say create for class, and we'll go ahead and we'll create it for this class that we just made here. And note, as discussed in the previous video, we're making a document which also has the ID, version, and a bunch of other properties associated with it. So we'll get all that. So that's the user schema. Let's take a look at the user controller. The user module. Actually, let's just go to the user service first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to generate a couple of things here. So I'm just going to run nestg to generate a controller for the user. I don't want a spec file. And since there already is a user folder here, it's just going to put the controller in that root folder there, or the user as the root folder there. And I'm going to do the same thing in the auth. So I have nestg controller in auth. And then I want to have a service for both. So I'll just say nest generate service auth. And then I'll do the same thing for user. And we can see that we've got those in there. If we just look at the auth module, we can see that that's referenced there. And then if we look in the user module, we can see that they're referenced there like that too. So let's start by looking at the user service. And in the user service, this is where we're going to inject our model. So in the service here, let's just make a constructor. So we're able to use that. And then of course, we're going to need to go to the module to declare that. So let me just open up the user module here. So I'm going to have some imports here. And what I'm going to have, what's going on, is an array. I'm going to import the Mongoose module. So I'm able to say that for a particular feature that we're going to have here, which is going to be an array of objects, and the object that we've defined here is going to be, we're going to call it user, and it's going to refer to that schema we just created as the user schema. So I'll just go ahead and get that, and I'll just put the comma here. So with that, we have now connected the the database representation to the object. So now we just need to be able to reference that in the user service here. So I'm going to, in the constructor params, have a inject model here, and we just called that user. And this is going to be a private. It's going to be a read-only user model, which is a model which is coming from Mongoose. I was getting the IntelliSense and then it disappeared. And it's going to be based on the user document. So we just created this type here, which is based on the user class and the document. Let's go ahead and grab that. And then we'll go ahead and we'll import that. And then we'll import the model. It's not giving me an IntelliSense, so I'm going to import it manually. And that's coming from Mongoose. So I'll go ahead and save that. Now I have access to the user model. I should be able to use it. So I'm also going to just create a quick interface. So we don't just return the user document. The user document, it has the password on it, and it also has the version and the other stuff on it. So I'm just going to, in user here, I'm just going to create an interface, user interface.ts, and I'm just going to go ahead and export an interface, and I'm just going to call it user here. And I actually might just call it user details just to make it a little more specific. So user-details, because I feel like user is going to be overloaded pretty quickly. So let's just call this user details .interface.ts, and then we can have an ID here. Notice in Mongoose it's underscore ID, so we want to just use just ID like that. We'll have a name, which is a string, and then we'll have an email, which is also a string. So now that we've got that, we can return to our user service that we're working on. And the first thing I want to do is I just want to have a helper method. So I'm going to have like a partial sort of function here. So I'll have an underscore in front of it. And that just denotes that I want to use it in conjunction with other methods. It also can be used to signify to JavaScript that it's a private method because you don't have any real private methods. But in this case, it's used in conjunction with methods. And that just helps me identify that it should be used in conjunction with other methods. So we'll have this helper here. So we're just going to take a user document, and in return we'll get the user details that we just created. And we can just return the ID, which is going to be the user._ID that we're getting here. We're going to get the name, which is the user name. And we're going to get the email, which is the user.email. And we'll just go ahead and we'll just save that there. So we're just getting that underscore ID as an error because we need to, rather than using the regular document, we need to import the document, and we import that from Mongoose. So let's go ahead and get that. And now when we save that, we can see that this error has gone away. So let's go ahead and continue working on our service here. So I think before we create the find users, we need to actually register a user. So to create a user, let's have an async function here. So we'll have an async function, we'll call it create, and it's take the name, which is a string, an email, which is a string, and it's going to take the hashed password. So we'll get into that in a minute, which is a string. And it's just going to return a promise for us for the user document, or of the user document type. And what we'll have is we'll say we'll have a new user is going to be equal to new this.user model, and then we'll just pass in the name, email, and password, which is going to be the hash password. And we'll talk about what the hash password is in just a second. We'll save that. And then we'll go ahead and we'll just return the new user. And then we'll just go ahead and we'll click, we'll type in save there. So let's just go over to our auth service. So let's open that up. And this is where we're going to begin to work on some of our auth related stuff. And we're actually going to need that user service. So since we need the user service, we're going to need to import the user module into our auth module. So if I just go ahead and open up that auth module, we can have some imports here. We can go ahead and we can import the user module. So we got that. So let's go back to, and we can close some of these up now. User schema we can close. User module will close. Main TS will close. So we've got this auth module here. We've got the auth service. Now in the user module, even though that we're importing the user module in, and you'd think that would contain everything in the user module, we're going to use the user service in the auth service, and we just need to explicitly say that we're going to use that user service in there, otherwise it won't work. Slightly counterintuitive, but it's just something to remember. So we've got that there. So let's just close the user module up. We'll go back to our auth service. And now we'll create a constructor here. So we can go ahead and we can create our user service. And that's going to be of the type user service. So what I'll also do here is I'm going to import bcrypt. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and we need to import OR as bcrypt from bcrypt because it doesn't support the named or default imports syntax. So, and the reason I want bcrypt, and what bcrypt does is when you save something into a database, you save an email and a password usually, along with some other user details. If someone became aware of our database or somehow hacked into it or got access to it, it would be a security breach if they had all of every single user's password. So what hashing does is it takes like a password, like a string or something like that, and then it goes ahead and it converts it into some sort of, hexadecimal value, or whatever it's going to convert it into. Just, a very, very long string that no one would ever guess to be the password. And it's a representation of the characters that you enter. And only the server really knows how to sort of decrypt that. So you're hashing sort of like a one-way sort of thing, unless you have like the details on how to unhash it sort of thing, like the algorithm behind it, which is sort of in the library. There's lots of clever things going on there that sort of help prevent that. But what we can do is when we, register an account, we hash the password, but we can also use the same algorithm that we use to hash the password with the bcrypt to, when we log in, and check the entered password by hashing that and comparing that to the hashed password. So that's like a security layer there. So I want to have a asynchronous function here called hash password, and it's just going to take the password as a string because the user's going to just type in their password into a text field, and then that's going to be sent in an API request. It's going to be sent over HTTPS, so there should be no bad actors intercepting that, and if they do, they should get some jargon or jumbled up stuff. So it's only when it hits our server that the server recognizes it as a string. And then we're going to take that string and we want to return another string. And the string we're returning is, the hashed password. So we can just go ahead and we can just use the bcrypt library for it. We don't have to, make it by scratch or anything like that. And there's a hash function here. If you just hover over it here, well, we're not getting much help there, but you just type in the password here, and it's probably a TypeScript type library for that, but I'm not going to do it. Just all it's doing here is it's got this 12. That's like the salt rounds, I believe it's called, and it just, it takes your password, and then after one iteration, you might get something like this or something like that. It's going to be a lot more longer than that. This is just to, at a high level, explain. But then the next round, it's going to take that string, and then it's going to convert each of it like this. And as you can see, as you do that multiple times, 12 tends to be like a standard sort of thing there. Obviously the more rounds you do, the longer it takes, but also the more secure it is. So 12 is sort of like an optimized number there. Like there's no way anyone's gonna, be able to hack through that. At least not to my knowledge. So yeah, that's the hashing of the password. So the next thing we probably want to do is have the ability to register. So let's have a function here, and I'll just take caps lock off, And I'm going to call this register. So this is going to take a user, and I'm actually going to create a DTO for this. So in the auth section here, actually in the user section, I'm going to have a new folder. So where is that? New folder. And I'm going to call these DTOs. So I don't think we touched on DTOs in the previous video, but basically it's the data transfer object. And if I just create one, it will probably become clear what's going on. So I'm going to have a new user.dto.ts, and I'm just going to export a class here. I'm going to call it new user DTO. And when you create a new user, it asks you for your name on Amazon. It asks you for an email, which is a string, and it also asks you for a password, which is a string. So basically what this, if you look at our other user in the user schema, you see that we've got the name, the email, the password. So it might look similar, but it also is a user document, so it has all the other properties and stuff associated with it. And the other thing to note is when you log in, for example, you only need the email and password. So you want to send a different object or a data transfer object. So in that case, we would have something like existing user. So we'll just go ahead and copy that. And it's just going to be the exact same thing, but instead of new here, we'll have existing. And instead of name, we can just go ahead and delete that. So in different circumstances, you can send different data across. So you don't have to use a DTO, but it's just a nice way to do things. So the reason I brought DTO up is because when we come to this user service here, or this auth service, we want to use the new user DTO, and we'll actually use TypeScript. TypeScript has a read-only type here, I believe. It might be lowercase read-only. So that's a TypeScript type, and that just makes it so that we can't change the properties, because we don't want to change what the user sent to us. This just sort of enforces that. So yeah, so we got that. So when a user does register, you know, it's going to be an asynchronous operation, so they'll get a promise back. And I want to give back the user details. And remember, the user details was a subset where the password was removed, because in this user service here, we had this, well, based on a user document, you can get the user details, which is just the ID, name, and email, which is what the interface represents, or the so, and it'll probably make more sense what this create method's doing as well, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. So when you register, you get back the user details, but that's only true if they register successfully. Otherwise, what I'm going to do here is say you get back null. Now I'm using null, and I'm going to use null for a few of these methods I'm doing in this particular video, because I haven't set up error handling yet, and we'll do that in another video. But just so the server doesn't completely crash on us, I'm just going to return null. So what we can do is we can just use some object destructuring here, and we can just say we want to get the name, the email, the password, and we can just get all those from our new user DTO here. And I can also go ahead and create a variable called existing user. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually, when we register a user, we need to see if there is a user already existing with that email. So I'm going to come back to the user service. So remember, the user service is where all the user stuff's happening. Everything related to the user document model. And then auth is where all the authentication stuff is happening. So, you know, logging in, registering, hashing the password, JSON Web Token stuff. And the user service is where all the user stuff is happening. So getting the user details, creating a new user. I'm also going to have the ability to find users. So I'm going to be able to find them in two different ways. The first way I want to be able to find a user is going to be by email, because that's what I want to check from that method I'm creating in auth. So they're going to pass in their email and password, and then based on their email, what we want to do is we just want to return the user document. So we want to return the user document because we'll need to look at their hashed password and then null for bespoke reasons. And then I'm just going to go ahead and return, and we got the user model set up. So I'm just going to say find one, which is a mongoose method, which takes options, and I can pass in email, and I can just go ahead and I can run the exec command here. So while I'm here, I may as well create the method to find by ID, because we're going to need to use that shortly anyway. So we'll just come here. We'll say ID. Now ID is a string as well. Now in this case, we can just return the user details or null, because we won't need the password. So in that case, so I'll just go ahead and I'll just say we'll have a variable here where we'll just await, and we can actually just use our method that we created. We're going to use the user model, and then we're going to just find by ID here, and then we'll just run exec on that. And basically what we'll do here, just for now, until we do better error handling, is if there's no user, we can just go ahead and return null. And otherwise, it will make it past that check. And then we can just convert it to get the user details. And that will remove the password for us. And then also the ID and version. And of course, we'll just need to pass in the user into there and save that. And now we can just go ahead and we can return to our auth service. And so we're registering an account. We passed in the name, the email, and the password. We want to check if there's an existing user. So we can go ahead and we can just await, and we can use this user service. And we can just go ahead and we can just find by email and just pass in the email, because we don't have the ID, so we need to find it by email. And then we can just have an if condition here. And if there is an existing user, what I'll do just for now until we get better error handling is we'll just say email taken. So that's cool. I guess technically we need a string here as well. So actually I might just change this to any, just for now. So all right, let's say we get past there's an existing user. That means the email is not taken, and that means we should be able to register our user. So what we can have is we can say, we can start to hash our password. So they pass in the password as a string. We can just say we want to get the hashed password, and we can just go ahead and we can just await this hash password, which is just this method here, which calls bcrypt with the 12 salting rounds. It changes it to a bunch of scribbled up text that we can't go backwards on. And that's what we're going to, and we do that because that's what we're going to store in the database. So what we need to do here is we just need to create a new user, and we can just await, and we have that create method in the user service there. So I can go ahead and just pass the name, email, and it's important that you type in the hashed password here. And that's why it's slightly different to the new user DTO, because this is a hash password rather than a password. You could create an object and an interface for it if you want. I don't find it necessary here. So just looking at the create method, you get the name, email, and hash password. And it's going to use the user model that we have access to. And it's just going to create the the new user, and it's going to save that to the database. And that new user that we await for, we can just go ahead and we can just return that, but we don't want to return the password back to the user. So let's just go ahead and use our helper method here to get the user details based on the new user here. So with that, we should be in a good position to be able to register. Well, we have the service set up to do so at least. So perhaps we should have a look at the controller. And if we open up the controller, we can go ahead and we can just create a method in here. So we're going to need that service. So let's just go ahead and say, for the auth service, and we'll just go ahead and we'll import that in, if it will let me. So I'm going to use the post request to register. And I'm just going to have a method called register, where in the body, what I'm expecting is a user, which is going to be of that new user DTO that we defined. And in response, what we'll get is we'll get a promise here. And it's going to give back the user details or null until we get some better error handling going. And we can just go ahead and we can just return this auth service, and we can just go ahead and register that particular user that got passed in here. So I just need to remove the method outside of the constructor. For some reason I didn't pick that up before. And then we can just go ahead and we can get the user details type in. So let's just grab that interface there. Let's just separate out our stuff, our imports. So yeah, we can hit the controller where it's expecting the new user DTO, which is the name, email, and password. We call the auth service register method. We look in the method here. And yeah, I mean, it's doing all the stuff we set up. So let's just run npm run start dev. I've already got my Docker container running. If I just create a new PowerShell here, I can just do a Docker PS to confirm that. And we can see we've got our Mongo Express and Mongo latest, so that's still running from before. If not from the root of the file folder, you would just have to run a docker-compose space up space -d, where the -d is optional for the detached mode. But let me just close this. If I refresh the Amazon database, we can see that we now have this users table or this user collection. So what I'll do is I'll just view that. There's nothing in it. But if I go to Postman here and I go to register and I register something here, we can actually see that we got back the ID, the name, and the email. So it doesn't give back the password. So that means if we look into our, let's just refresh our schema here, or our collection, we can see that we've now got this document here. And we can see that we've got the ID, we've got this password, which is just, you know, scrambled. It's not hexadecimal, actually, looking at it, because there's Q's and stuff in it, letters past F. But it's just a big string of characters there. So it doesn't store our password directly in there. And then, of course, has the version and the other details there. So let's just go back there. So that's awesome. Now, if I was to run that one more time, you'll get email taken. So obviously we want to have better, you know, error handling there. But it does the job and it doesn't crash the server. So that's a plus. All right. So now that we've got the register method going, let's go ahead and get the login method going. So for the login method, I'm just going to come to auth modules, because we're going to need the JSON web token module. So what we'll have here is we'll just take the JSON web token module from NestJS / JSON web token here. And then it has a method on it called register async. And then from there, we can just go ahead and we can use the factory method. And with that, we can just go ahead and we can just specify what we want to return here. So we want to return an object. So we can just say in parentheses the object that we wish to return. Now I'm going to type in the secret here. And I'm just going to have a secret. And the secret, if you're not familiar with JSON Web Tokens, it's just when you create it, a JSON Web Token, in addition to our payload or the contents in the object, we want to have some sort of secret and also have a salt associated with it. So the algorithm in which the JSON Web Token scrambles up all the letters, you know, can't necessarily be replicated. So if I'm on another machine, I couldn't just, you know, guess the JSON Web Token sort of thing and back engineer it. So you can also just go to JWT.io. They have like a quick 1-minute visualization of that means if you're not familiar with that. But I'm just sort of assuming that you've used JSON Web Tokens in some capacity. But if not, do go to JWT.io. So you also have the sign options here. And I should note that this secret here, you could reference this from, if you had a .env file, you can run process.env and then whatever the variable is called, say JWT secret, and have that set up. I did do that in my LinkedIn project. I'm not going to do it in this particular project. And there isn't really any security issues with this approach because it's on the server anyway. But just for that extra layer, if you want it, you could run that. Just thought I'd mention that. And I'm just going to have expires in, and I'm just going to have 3600 seconds. So it means the JSON Web Token will last 1 hour. So 60 seconds times 60 minutes is 3,600 seconds. Or something like that. So since we have that JWT, we can now use the JWT in our auth service. So let's go have a look at our auth service here. And we've sort of done the registration and the hashing of the password. So let's begin to work on a method here. So I'm actually going to create a couple of helpers. So I'm going to have an async function here. And I'm just going to say, does the password match? And I'm just going to have a password and the hashed password, which is a string, both strings. And then there is some asynchronous behavior that's happening for this bcrypt library. So I'm just going to return bcrypt here. And there's a compare method on it. And we can just go ahead and we can just type in our password here with our hashed password here. And that just does take a little bit of time and it returns true or false. If the passwords match, it will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. So the idea is when the user types in their password and they send it across, we can, if we have access to the hash password, which we have access to when we'll validate the user, we can compare the two and see if they match. And of course, if you're on someone else's server or something like that, the hash isn't going to be the same on their server as it will be on our server. So even if you, know the password somehow, if you're looking at the database and you're looking at the hash passwords, you can't necessarily map one-to-one because you got that, we've got some of this password hashing here. It's got the 12 rounds and then it's also got the secret associated with it as well. So the algorithm takes all those into account and you'll get some sort of hash password. So I'm just going to, before we log in, we need to validate if the user, is a real user and if their credentials match. So I'm just going to have a method here, which it takes the email, which is a string, and it also takes the password, which is also a string. And then it's just going to return back a promise, and we'll give back the user details, which is the user document with the, the version and the password omitted. And we can just say return that or null. And so what we'll have in as our logic here is we'll create a constant variable. We'll call it user. And we can just await this user service. And since we have that find by email method, we can just, they're trying to log in now. So, we can see if an email exists. And in this case, if the email, well, what they'll get back here is, they'll get back a user if it exists. Otherwise, they'll get back something like null or a nullish variable, a falsy variable. So we can have this other variable here. We'll say, does the user exist? Does user exist? And we can say that's equal to not bang bang user. So the first bang, it tells you like if it's a string, well, actually what we're expecting here is an object. So the first thing is it not defined? So then if it's not defined, it means it is defined. So it just takes any non-falsy value and returns a Boolean. So it's just like a little, not a hack, but just a little trick to tell if this exists. Otherwise it would be null, because if it was null, not null, not null, the user doesn't exist, which is this case here. And then if it doesn't exist, we'll just go ahead and we'll just return null. But if it does make it past there, what we can do is we can say, okay, well, the email exists. Now, does the password match? So we can just go ahead and we can just call, we can have a variable here, does password match? And then we'll just go ahead and we'll just wait for this does password match. And then we'll have the password in here. And we want to, so the password that they entered is the first variable or the first argument. And the second argument is the hash password. So when we get this find by email, we can see that on the user service, unlike the ID where we're changing it, we're just going to get back the user document, which actually does have the password on it. So because it does have the password on it and it's set up like that on purpose, we can use that password. And remember, once they've, in the database sort of thing, it's going to be the hash password. So this compare function, it essentially hashes this password with the same algorithm. It compares it to the existing hash password. And if it matches, well, it will return true, otherwise it will return false. So we can just do another check here. And actually I can just copy something like this here. And if the password doesn't match, I'm just going to return null. But if it makes it past that, it means the passwords do match. That means I'm able to use the user service. And I'll just go ahead and return the user details here. And we'll be able to use that in the next part. So the next part is logging in. So that's what we've been waiting for. So we have an async function here. We'll call it login. It takes an existing user, which is of the type existing user DTO, which is just an email and a password that we created before. And it's going to return a promise here. Now I'm going to have this type here. I'm going to write it in the return type here. It's an object which has token here and a string, or it's going to be null. And what I can do here is I can just use some object destructuring to get the email and password from the existing user. I'll just go ahead and save that. Pretty will help me out a little bit. And if I just get the user, and I get that by awaiting this .validate user for the email and the password. So just recall we made that just before. So you go to log in, the person sends the email and password, then we validate that. If it makes it past all the checks, we'll get the user details. But if it doesn't, we can just say we'll just return null. And all these returning nulls we want to handle better with error handling, but we'll get to that. I do have a video on that as well, but I'll probably get to that later in this course anyway. But if we do make it past there, this is where we can await our JSON Web Token. So we can just say this JSON Web Token service. So actually I think we need to import the JSON Web Token service here. So we've got this set up here. We've got the JWT module set up. So what we can do is in the constructor here, we can just reference the JWT service, which is the JWT service. And we imported that earlier. So we can come back to our login method. So we can use that service, and on that service there's a sign async function, and you just pass in the user. So we're getting the user here, which has the name, email, password, and they're the same properties that we're going to check, that we're going to sign. So it doesn't have, it doesn't have the password on it. It has the name and email, and the ID. And we're creating a JSON web token, which takes that object and it changes the form of it into a JSON web token, such that we can attach that to further requests. And then when further requests are made, our server will detect the JSON web token, and if it matches and is valid, then we can go ahead and make those requests. So we'll take a look at guards in just a moment, but just to, end this function here, we can just go ahead and just return the JSON web token as an object there. So now we've created all of the logic for that. We can go ahead and we can go to the auth controller, and we can actually begin to work on the login method. And let's just copy this post down, because it's also going to be a post. And let's hit the endpoint /login or /API/auth/login. And let's have a method here called login. Now, one thing to note, when we made this HTTP request before, we were creating this resource, and a resource created is a 201 status code. And by default, NestJS will put that status code there for you. However, when we log in, we're not actually, we need to do a post request because we need to have a body with the details, and a get request shouldn't be used for that. So we have a post request, but we don't actually necessarily are creating a resource. So what we can do here is we can overwrite the default status code with this HTTP status code annotation. And there's also this HTTP status enum, and that has a bunch of the status codes on it. So like OK, for example, which is a 200. If you just F12 into the HTTP status, you can see all of the status codes. So common ones you're probably familiar with is 404, and we just want to return a 200. You could also probably do accepted as well. It's really up to you how you want to do it. This, different status codes can be used. Some are more semantic than others, but it's close enough sort of thing. So you can have a user here. Now this is going to be the existing user this time. So I'll just go ahead and import that. And rather than user details back here, we're going to get the token, which is a string or null. So now we can use this auth service. We can go ahead and we can just log in with that user. So how cool is that? Let's go ahead and test that out. So I've just created an account with john@test.com, and the password's password. If I go to API/auth/login and I click send here, we can see that we've got this JSON web token here. So just to, I'm going to go to JWT.io just to sort of bring the point home here. If you haven't seen JSON web tokens before, but if you have, it's a good reminder anyway. We can see that this is the default JSON web token here. There's a payload, which is the data. It also has the algorithm type it uses, and it indicates it's a JSON web token. And then, it has this verify signature here, so you can put your secret in here. So yeah, let me just type in my JSON web token here. So you can see that I've got this user here, which is the user ID, the name, the John. So that's the payload there. It also has this IAT and EXP. And I believe this is initialized at an expiry date. So if you add 3600 seconds, or it might be milliseconds, I'm not sure. Oh yeah, it says seconds since Unix epoch. So you add 3600 to that number, and you should be able to get this number here. Often epoch time or whatever is in milliseconds after 1970 or something like that. But in this case, it's seconds. So you can see that the the configuration for the JSON Web Token seems to be matched there. And if I just type in, I don't know if this will work. If I type in secret here, notice when you type in something like any other characters, it changes this part of the token. So only this token, this entire token, but with this bit here there as well, will be accepted by our server. So even if you had all the other details right, but the secret wasn't the same, it won't work. And the secret's on our server, so they actually have to send the body, the payload, to our server. You know, there's this header algorithm which just says what type it is and stuff like that. It's a JWT. But really it's this combination of the three that allow for the security to be so great. I mean, obviously, if you dive deeper into it, there's arguments on both sides. JSON Web Tokens versus sessions and what's more secure and all that. But really, the end of the day, they're both pretty good. You know, no one's going to hack you with them, most likely, so you can, you know, feel secure. So now that I've created the ability to register and log in, I mean, that's already a huge step. That's sort of the main goal here. But when we log in, what we want to do is we also want to protect a resource. So for example, the product, let's say you log in to Amazon.com, you log in, you have to log in to be able to, like, I don't know, if you want to post something, like sell a product or something like that, you know, you should be logged in to be able to do that. I don't know if you can buy stuff if you're not logged in, or maybe you need to be logged in because you need to have all your details and stuff like that. I'll get into the front end after this video actually, so I'll start to look at the side a bit more and, you know, tee it all up. But essentially what I want to do is just protect an API endpoint in general. So to be able to do that, I just want to add a couple of things. So in auth here, I want to add a folder here. I'm going to call this guards. And I'm going to have a JWT guard.ts. And what this is going to be is this is actually going to be a service. So I'm just going to copy this bit here. It's a service, but you know, it's a special type where we're using it as a guard, but it is at the end of the day just a service. So I'm just going to get the injectable in. That's all I really wanted. The other thing I want to do is just rename it to JWT guard. So the class is JWT guard. So it's a very, very small service here. And the reason it can just be like this is because, you know, with object-oriented programming, you can extend classes. So I just want to extend it so then we have access to this guard here that we can apply elsewhere. So we can just extend or use extends auth guard, and that's coming from NestJS Passport. And there's various implementations you can have here. So I'm going to have the JWT here, the JWT strategy, I believe. So that's all we need to do to have the JWT guard. So it's quite simple. It's all set up for us basically. But we will need to have another file called jwt.strategy.ts. Now I'm also just going to copy this because it's a good starting point here. And I'm just going to close this up. So I'll get rid of the auth guard here. We no longer need to extend it, but we just need a service here. I mean, it's slightly easier than generating it, and I've already got the server running. But this is going to be the JWT strategy in this case. We don't want it from there. Actually, we do, but not. No, we don't want it from the test section. We want JWT strategy which extends passport strategy. And that takes strategy from passport JWT here. So we've installed that. So, okay. I should probably go to the auth module. And in the auth module, I just need to say that in addition to the auth service providers, because these guards and strategies are services, we can use them here in the providers. So we got the JWT guard, import that, and the JWT strategy. And the good thing is, when we import this, because we've got this JWT module, hold on, user module. So the good thing is, since we've got this JWT module, and then we're importing the JWT guard and JWT strategy, there's lots that's set up for us. So based on the JWT guard here, it employs a particular strategy, and then through the module and these files here, it just seems to join it all together for us. So it makes it really easy for us to create the guards, because the guards are already created. We're just sort of using them, let's say. But we do need to just do a couple of things in here. So the first thing we want to do is we need a constructor. And the reason we need a constructor is because we need a constructor for the base class. So we need to actually call that constructor. So to be able to do that, we need to call the super method inside the constructor, and then we just pass an object full of properties. So essentially that's just saying, for our JWT strategy that we're using in combination with our JWT guard and module, the base class that we're extending needs a couple of properties, and then all of the configuration stuff is sort of done for us. But we need some sort of, like, there's multiple ways to do this, and we need some sort of a couple of things we just need to put here. So the first one is the JWT from request. So what this is here is we just want to, basically what we want to do is whenever we have a protected route, that route that we're calling as the endpoint, we're expecting the token, the JSON Web Token, to be part of the headers. So when the user signs in on the front end, the token that got sent back to them is attached to all of the future requests that they send. So we can actually call this method here, extract JWT from passport, and then we can just run from auth header as bearer token, and that will do that for us. So when it comes back to our server, it's expecting it on the bearer token or from the header, and if it's valid, and then it will just work, sort of thing. So we can also have this other one, ignore expiration, and we can set this to false, because I think by default it's true, and if it isn't, it's just an extra line here. But I believe that even if you create a JSON Web Token and it expires in 3600 seconds or an hour, it might still work unless you have this extra option here. So the other thing we need here is the secret or key. And we, in our app module, I believe. No, not app module. Was it auth module? In our auth module where we set the JWT up, we had this secret here. And you could have that in an environment file as discussed before, but we won't do that. I've done in that other video as mentioned. And I might have another series where I go through some NestJS techniques and stuff like that. So rather than doing a big project, I'll color all of the details. But I don't know, that's just something I'm thinking on the side for now. And it's all secure anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But you could have process.env.the JWT secret here. It's just I got Docker set up as well, so there's a couple of extra steps. It's not too hard, but I just want to focus on development. So it has the secret as well. So basically we're just saying where we're expecting it from. So we're expecting it from the header. What is the secret? So that secret needs to match what we're doing. So the secret's called when we create the JSON Web Token, but then when we also verify it, or we have a guard that needs to verify it, we need to make sure the secrets match. So we need those properties. And then this is sort of an optional one where we want to ignore expiration, or we don't want to ignore the expiration. So it's pretty simple, really. It's just, calling a super or a constructor of a constructor, basically, of the base class. But there's just one more method. It's going to be super easy because the whole thing is that this class that we're extending, it has a method that we need to enforce and consume from our this extended class here, and that's validate. So basically what's going to happen is somebody is going to send a request, and it could be any request because it could be hitting any of our endpoints. So we have a payload here, and it's okay to call it the any type because we're really expecting anything, any type of object. Or you could have a generic, I suppose. But it doesn't really matter because we're not really using it anywhere. And what we'll do is we'll just return the user from the payload. So what's happening is a user sends a request, and a user sends a request, and they're going to have on the payload, the user object will be there. And when we validate that the JSON Web token is correct, we're only really interested in the user details. So we'll just go ahead and get the payload and get the user on there and return that object there. So yeah, that's the setting up of the guard. So all we really need to do now is just consume the guard somewhere. So we've got this, where's a good spot to put it? We've got this product controller here. So let's just go ahead and we've got this token here as well. I want to, when we created, I'll create a new user here. When we created that, we got the ID. So I think what I want to do is I want to have a user controller to be able to get the user. So let's just start on that. So it's going to be really simple. I just want to get that so then I can get some information there. So we'll just have the constructor, and we'll just go ahead and we'll inject the user service, which is the user service. And then we'll just close up the close code block there. Now we're going to have a get method, and we want to be able to get the user based on the ID. So we can have this async function here. And I don't think we don't actually need the async function on the controller. So we can go ahead and we can get that as a dynamic variable. So /user/ whatever the ID is. So you create an account, then you get the ID back, and then we can have a param here, and then we have an ID, which is just matching the dynamic part there, which is a string. And I'm just going to return a promise, which is going to have the user details or null. So I'm just going to return this user service, and we created this earlier, defined by ID, and then we'll just pass in the ID here. And I'll just go ahead and import this. So now, for this particular user that we created, we get that ID there, and then we should be able to get that ID. So that's cool. That's just like a helper sort of function, just so we got one function on our user controller. We'll end up building that up. But you know, we've got that separation between the user and the auth stuff there. So what I want to do is just protect a route, and I'm just going to protect the product route that we created in the previous video here. So if I just go to product and I open up the product controller and I navigate to, this one here. I'm not going to protect all the routes just yet. I'll fix up the protection of the routes as needed. But I'm going to have this annotation here, use guards, that's built into NestJS. And then we can just use the JWT guard here. So that's all we have to do. And now if I make this request, so it says that we're not authorized, and this is better error handling, and that's done for us. So that's cool. We're not authorized because we haven't attached our token. But if we get our token from our login here, we can go ahead and we can just go to bearer token here in the authorization tab. And then we can just click in, copy and paste our token here. And now you can see that we actually do have that. So that's how guards work. So I'll just recap everything that we've done here today, and then I'll just talk about what we're going to be doing next in the next video here. So basically what we've done here is we've created two modules, a user module and an auth module. So in the auth module, there's two methods in our controllers. We have register and login. So registering, if we just drill into the method here by clicking F12, we can see that we check if there's an existing user. We hash the password if there is an existing user. And then we go ahead and we create a new user. And the login method here, what this is doing for us is it's going to validate that the user, the email and password match. And then if they do, they'll create a JSON web token. Now, JSON web tokens, when they're, assigned, they're going to be assigned to the front end and they're going to be attached to the headers. And for further, for protected routes, we can just go ahead and use the JWT guard there. So, and protect the route as needed. So yeah, that's everything I really wanted to cover in this video. Now, if you're interested in role-based access control, or RBAC, which is essentially like, let's say you log in as an administrator, or you log in as a super user, or you log in as, you know, there's different roles and there's different access levels for the different roles there. Like an admin might be able to do everything, let's say, but a premium user might only be able to, you know, get and post products, for example, but an admin might be able to edit them or something like that. You need to start looking into role RBAC. Now, I've actually done a video on this already in my LinkedIn series. So if you've watched this one and you want to do that, I believe it's the 9th video in the LinkedIn video series. So even though in that series we're using Postgres, you only really need the most basic Mongoose methods that we've used in this video. So like save and find and stuff like that. So it should be quite trivial if you watch that other video to implement it into Mongoose based on what we've done here. So I'd highly suggest checking out that video if you're interested in that. Now, we're not going to do that in this particular video series because I've already done that. And I also want to focus more on the e-commerce side of things. So, you know, payment gateways, perhaps with Stripe. And I also want to set up the front end. So in the next video, we'll probably set up the front end for the authentication pages in React. And I want to do it with modern React with functional components. And I also want to use the Redux architecture. So set it up like I'm setting up like a big project, an enterprise grade project. And have the async thunk stuff going on in that Redux there, in that architecture there with the Flux design pattern. So that's what we'll work on in the next video. Then we'll end up looking at some error handling a little later on and stuff like that. Obviously the payment gateway, that's the exciting stuff. But yeah, I think we'll jump into React for a couple of videos, then jump back over to Nest, and just continue that sort of process. So I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.